I don't think these reds match. Oh well. When you think of the Duke of Windsor, what comes to mind? Is it a lovesick puppy of a man who threw away everything for his beloved? A spineless simpleton who lives to obey his exacting wife's every whim? Or perhaps a coward who ran away from his duty? These are all descriptions of the Duke that have not only prevailed through time, but that have essentially been superimposed onto his relative, a man very commonly referred to as the modern-day Duke of Windsor, Prince Harry of Montecito, who is now, by the way, embroiled in yet another legal drama of his own making. After NGN, the defendant in the ongoing phone hacking case, has accused Harry of deliberately destroying evidence. And this isn't just sensational headlines. According to an article by The Times, Mr. Justice Fancourt, the judge presiding over the case, said there was evidence that, quote, a large number of potentially relevant documents and confidential messages between Harry and his ghostwriter were destroyed sometime between 2021 and 2023, well after this claim was underway. Did you catch that? There is evidence to suggest that this is what happened. Right now, as it stands, the judge has ordered Harry to provide a witness statement to explain what happened. So I suppose we'll just have to wait and see. In the UK, destroying evidence with intent is known as spoliation. And while I'm not too sure what the consequences are in the UK, whether it's simply sanctions or remedies for the defendant, this is really not a good look for Prince Harry. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, the Duke of Windsor has never done such a thing or anything of a similar level, or worse, perhaps. He simply abdicated for love, right? Well, if you watched part 1 of this series, the Sussex-Windsor Files, then you would know the answer is no. He did possibly a lot worse than Harry. Because what if I told you that there is an alternate story? One that paints the Duke not as the hapless yet hopeless, lovesick fool that history has made him out to be, but as a scheming and treacherous man, eager to overthrow his brother and reinstall himself, along with his new wife, as king of a new world order. In part 1 of this series, where we talked about Edward and Wallis's proposed worldwide peace movement and compared it to Meghan and Harry's worldwide privacy tour, I mentioned 3 articles published by The Hill within the last 2 years about Harry and Meghan effectively being a threat to national security, with these articles being the impetus for this entire series. In that video, we briefly discussed the Heart of Darkness article, which was relevant to their tour to Nigeria. And we used that as a springboard to compare it to Wallis and Edward's 1937 trip to Germany as part of their so-called worldwide peace movement. And by the way, if you haven't seen part 1, I will be linking it up in the cards and, if I remember, in the description below. So feel free to check it out whenever you can. I also gave a very important disclaimer in part 1, but I feel as though no one's going to bother to go listen to that before we start this one. So a very brief version of it. No, I am not equating Meghan and Harry to Nazis, Nazi sympathizers, Hitler, Nazi Germany, whatever the case may be. And you can watch part 1 for the full disclaimer, because ain't nobody got time for that. We need to get into this video. So for part 2, we will be asking and attempting to answer the following. Were the Windsors and are the Sussexes the Dukes and Duchesses of treachery? Or are they more akin to useful idiots? Well, to answer that, we can turn to the various sources that I listed in part 1, FBI files, the Windsor File, The Traitor King, which is a book that I have read in preparation for this series, and miscellaneous online sources that I found. But specifically for Meghan and Harry, we could turn to the first 2 articles published by The Hill relevant to their so-called form of treachery. The first article, titled "The Trouble with Harry and Meghan," discusses how Meghan and Harry's labeling of the Commonwealth as the Empire 2.0 poses a national security risk not just to the UK, but the Commonwealth, by effectively bolstering China and Russia's disinformation campaigns and other nefarious attempts to destabilize the Commonwealth and effectively destroy it, take over it, do away with it, whatever it is. The second article, titled Harry and Meghan Knives Out in Jamaica, criticized their childish games to one-up William and Catherine, and possibly even King Charles and Queen Camilla, by deliberately being seen as cozying up to Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness, who famously attempted to embarrass William and Catherine during their tour of the Caribbean in 2022, when he informed them, in front of rolling cameras, that it was time for Jamaica to move on from the Commonwealth. It is worth noting that the articles don't necessarily have a problem with Jamaica's desire to be entirely independent of the Commonwealth, to become a republic, but they argue that as the king's son, for Harry to do that was a very bad look and played right into these foreign powers' plans to weaken the king's realm. They also argue that the reason that Catherine and William's tour was considered as catastrophic 2 years ago was related to this disinformation campaign of colonialism and racism that foreign powers were pushing out. They also talk about how tasteless it was for Harry to say something as dumb as, "I had to be here," meaning Jamaica, when both his father and sister-in-law were going through very real and very serious health issues. Because the truth is, Harry, no, you really didn't have to be there. Neither you nor your wife were attached to the One Love Bob Marley project. It wasn't a Netflix production, it was a Paramount film. So you had no contractual obligations or any obligations whatsoever to fly all the way from Montecito to Jamaica, other than to satisfy you and your wife's insatiable desire for attention and one-upmanship. Let's not forget that. As the authors put it, they were foolishly and selfishly, quote, ambulance chasing and appeared to be vainly attempting to profit from their family's medical challenges, which is a very apt conclusion that I believe we can all agree on, unless you're a Sussex squatty, in which case,
get out of my channel.
But when it comes to their motives, could they be that basic and straightforward and petty? Is it really just a constant attention grab and a one-sided popularity contest with the real royals, coupled with utter insouciance to their family's asperity? Or are they actively and deliberately trying to destroy the very fabric of the Commonwealth and the British monarchy in a classic case of, well, if I'm going down, you're all going down with me? The authors at The Hill seem to think that Meghan and Harry are nothing but useful idiots. And while I'm inclined to agree, or at least part of me is, I would also ask, ¿por qué no los dos? Two things can be true at the same time. Personally, aside from an enormous ego that demands constant attention in the same way that we need oxygen, I see a very vindictive streak in Meghan Markle. Harry as well, but Meghan is absolutely brimming with it. And aside from this either intentional or accidental bolstering of China and Russian and other foreign powers' propaganda to destabilize the Commonwealth, we know that Harry and Meghan have been at the forefront of the war against free speech. But we also know that in the grand scheme of things, these two are merely pawns. Useful idiots used and perhaps even supported by the faceless elites who want to impose this dystopian world order upon us. Why else would organizations like the Aspen Institute, or even individuals such as Hillary Clinton, be such vocal supporters of the Sussexes? If you'd like to hear more on this discussion, check out a recent video that I made. I'll be putting it up in the cards on this topic. In my books, for Harry and Meghan to deliberately set out to destroy the monarchy and the Commonwealth is entirely plausible. I mean, they have an entire Netflix series, practically 6 episodes, trying to do just that. So I think labeling them merely as useful idiots and nothing more is vastly understating what I believe to be their true intentions are. But Can we say the same about their predecessors and their involvement in World War II almost a century ago? The year was 1939, and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were settled down in a mansion close to the Bois de Boulogne and the Saint-Cloud Golf Club in the 16th arrondissement in Paris. It was a stately and imposing home, which Wallis ensured was decorated in as regal a fashion as possible. But while the couple busied themselves with their new household, war was very quickly brewing within Europe. Remember when I mentioned in part 1 that Edward was decidedly anti-war and was prepared to work with the Nazis in the name of peace? There was reason to doubt him, with an example we used being his alleged eagerness for Britain to be bombed into submission, which is hardly peaceful. But there is also some evidence that he truly did want to avoid war altogether. First, and much to the chagrin of the royal family and the British government, he went against everyone's advice by going political in the months preceding the war when he agreed to make an appeal for peace via the American network NBC from Verdun.
I speak simply as a soldier of the last war. The supreme importance of averting war will, I feel confident, impel all those in power to renew their endeavors to bring about a peaceful settlement.
And when it was broadcast in America, it was initially received quite favorably, making it all the way to Congress. But that all changed when the Americans learned of his questionable Nazi acquaintances and friendships, resulting in perceptions of his plea for peace to be marred by suspicion, going as far as surmising that this was yet another attempt on the part of the Duke to simply upstage his brother the King, who had just left for the States, along with his wife the Queen, on a goodwill tour. And honestly, I would be a lot more inclined to believe that it was an earnest attempt at securing worldwide peace had it not been for this crucial detail. Because deciding to broadcast to America just when your brother the King is going to America just reeks of Meghan and Harry's tactics that we see till this very day, where they know something's going on with the royal family, whether it's a personal birthday or an event, and lo and behold, they're in the tabloids trying to upstage them yet again. But then we have a second instance that supports the Duke's proclaimed aversion to war. On the 27th of August 1939, Edward wrote to Hitler and stated the following: "Remembering your courtesy in our meeting 2 years ago, I address to you my entirely personal, simple, though very earnest plea for your utmost influence towards a peaceful solution of the present problems." He received a response from Hitler 6 days later, stating, "Assure you that attitude towards England remains the same, and my wish to avoid a new war between our two countries remains. It depends, however, on England whether relations between the Germans and English can find the correct channel." But whatever Edward's intentions were, we all know what happened next. On the 1st of September 1939, World War II officially started. And 2 days later, on September the 3rd, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. If you watched part 1, or if you're otherwise historically inclined and you're very well learned in this area, you'd know that the Duke of Windsor was very unabashedly pro-German, even when he was a king. Not only did he consider himself to be German, which the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha family technically was, but he was also openly a fan of Nazi Germany and Hitler's tyrannical style of leadership. And this kinship that he felt for Nazi Germany, put on full display during his trip to Germany with Wallis in 1937, didn't go unnoticed by the Nazis, who would eventually plan to abduct the couple, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll get to that soon. Aware of the very real risk of getting abducted, as opposed to Meghan and Harry's delusions and fake catastrophic car chases, Walter Monckton, later the Viscount Monckton of Brenchley, a British lawyer and politician who served as an advisor to Edward during the abdication crisis, arranged for the couple to be flown back to the UK. Except instead of being grateful and cooperative considering the gravity of the situation, we're in the midst of a world war here, Edward, in a very Harold, as William calls him, like fashion, decides to have a hissy fit and make demands of his brother in exchange for going back, which, mind you, was done for their benefit. Amongst these demands was to house Edward and Wallis in one of the royal residences and to send them a destroyer or other naval vessel to travel on, seeing as Wallis had a fear of flying and their luggage wouldn't fit on a plane, because priorities, right? Now, Churchill, who had just been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, had a bit of a soft spot for Edward and tended to bow to his whims every now and then. So a destroyer was sent to the couple as requested, and they arrived in England on the 8th of September 1939, with no one from the royal family to greet them. Not even a car was sent to fetch them. I think even Meghan and Harry got a better deal than that when they showed up at the Platinum Jubilee, right?
We want privacy! We want privacy!
To make things concise, their stay didn't exactly go down too well. They didn't stay at a royal residence, and after a catastrophic meeting between Edward and his brother the King, who later wrote of Edward's immense selfishness and his lack of trustworthiness in his diary, Edward was offered and forced to accept the role of liaison with the British military mission in France, because the King didn't want him anywhere near England during the war, for fear of him compromising Britain's position by leaking information to the enemy. So, removing the Nazi aspect, once again, we have such a striking parallel here, in the sense that currently Prince William, as we know, not only wants nothing to do with Harold, but wants him nowhere near his family, because they tend to gather information, twist it, manipulate it, and later publish it to the demise of the royals and for their own gain. Speaking of parallels, according to a diary entry by a Windsor acquaintance called Baba Metcalf, Wallis said they realized there was no place ever for him in this country, and she saw no reason ever to return. Their selfishness and self-concentration is terrifying. What I am finding it difficult to put into words is the reason for his only having so few friends. One is so perpetually disappointed. Tell me that diary entry, written in 1939, doesn't read as though it was written about Meghan and Harry today. The royal family at the time also made their feelings quite clear in their private communications. The Queen wrote to Edward's mother, Queen Mary, "I haven't heard a word about Mrs. Simpson. I trust that she will soon return to France and stay there." Stay there written in capital letters for emphasis. "I am sure that she hates this dear country, and therefore she should not be here in wartime." And so, after a very brief and unsuccessful stay in England, return to France the couple did. But the trouble was only just beginning. Just over 6 months later, which the Duke and Duchess mostly spent performing their assigned duties to aid the war effort, a point which we will potentially explore further in this series, we arrive at the 10th of May 1940, when the Germans invaded France at dawn, targeting a weak entry point identified by Edward himself in a report as part of his duties, a report which was largely ignored by the British government. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Edward himself must have leaked the report and the weak points to the Germans, right? It couldn't possibly be a coincidence that the German military just so happened to arrive at the same conclusions as Edward in his report. And I initially had thought that too, only to remember that A, I am military, and when you use maps to strategize, it really isn't that far-fetched for different militaries to arrive at the same conclusion, looking at the terrain and just the geography, the topography, to ascertain the weakest point of entry. But more importantly, Edward informed the UK of these weak points. And he was right. They ended up being weak points. He wasn't trying to mislead the UK or try to open up some kind of a back door for the Germans to enter through. Could it be, though, that he later leaked this information after the British government pretty much ignored him? Could it have been part of a hissy fit at his demotion because he wasn't really happy with the role he was given in France? We know that Edward was furious when he accidentally learned that his brother, the King, gave an order effectively banning Edward from accessing any areas in France occupied by British troops. So could he have leaked those weak points later in revenge? Or was there a mole in his circle? Well, remember that pesky Charles Bideau that we discussed in part 1? Turns out he was a mole, with an MI6 officer alleging that Bideau, still friendly with the Duke at that time, brought defense materials, strengths, weaknesses, and so on of the best quality to the Germans on an almost fortnightly basis. And it's information like this that truly makes me pause and think, was Edward a treacherous Duke? Or was he simply a useful idiot? Interestingly, in the days succeeding the German invasion of France, Edward supposedly spent days destroying classified documents in the British embassy, which ostensibly points to him not being a traitor. But of course, he also could have, either intentionally or accidentally, already passed on the classified information that he was destroying to the Nazis. Wallis's alleged closeness to Joachim von Ribbentrop, briefly discussed in part 1 as well, was also at the forefront of the British government's mind. To many, and you'll notice a parallel here, it was she who was the weak point, the leak, not necessarily Edward himself. They surmised that Edward would tell her things, which she would then relay to Ribbentrop. I suppose kind of like how Harry would run back to Meghan and tell her things about his family, like speculating about what a new baby in the family is gonna look like, for instance, only to have Meghan twist it into an unrecognizable lie to destroy Harry's family. Regardless, on the 28th of May, after months of Edward's keenness for his post deteriorating, he deserted his military post and fled for Biarritz, en route to Madrid with Wallis without telling a soul. Now, you might be thinking, oh, he's fleeing the war because it's entered into France and he wants to keep himself and his wife safe. Yeah, think again. Turns out, Madrid just so happened to be the greatest concentration of the German intelligence services outside Berlin and was effectively a German protectorate. Which begs the question, why did Edward suddenly flee to Madrid, of all places, without telling anyone? And for a man with strong German affiliations and sympathies to end up in Madrid, of all places, I don't know. It just doesn't sit well with me. Now, while the Windsors were in Madrid, not only were they surrounded by German agents all the time, but they were also under constant surveillance by them, with regular reports being sent to Ribbentrop and Hitler and other key German and even Kremlin officials on their movements. All of this made it all the more urgent for the British government to extract them out of Spain and get them to neighboring Portugal until they could go back to England, which was the plan. But things were still on track for the couple to leave for the UK until Churchill basically threw a curveball, taking everyone by surprise when he offered Edward the role of governor of the Bahamas. Basically to keep him as far away from Europe as possible because he was really proving to be a problem. But rather than this being a simple, straightforward solution, it ultimately led to the formation of Operation Willie. In a nutshell, Operation Willie was devised by the Nazis as a last-ditch effort to get the Duke of Windsor firmly on their side, to install him as, or reinstall rather, as the King of England, with the hope being that his brother King George VI would abdicate after the planned attack on London. So Edward was basically being pulled from two directions. You know, you've got Britain on the one hand, and then you've got the Nazis on the other. The Nazis sensed his hesitation, and so they tried to devise various ways to lure Edward and Wallis back to Spain, back to Madrid in particular, where they wouldn't be under constant surveillance and protection of the British authorities in Portugal. They went as far as sending out an agent personally picked by Hitler from his paramilitary called Walter Schellenberg to scare Edward into returning to Spain lest he and his wife get murdered by British intelligence. Now, the British government had its own spies and were very well aware of this ploy. So they sent Walter Monckton, As you remember, I mentioned earlier, a person who previously was an advisor of Edward's when he was king. They sent him off to Lisbon with a letter from Churchill, where he warns Edward about the importance of optics, as in the governor of the Bahamas must be seen as being in step with the British government. There are rumors that the letter contained more than just that, and that Churchill may have threatened to leak unsavory information about Wallis if the Duke didn't willingly go to the Bahamas as planned, but I can't verify that. What we do know, though, is that whatever was in that letter clearly had an impact on Edward, who, despite still being actively involved with Nazi agents in Portugal, at least according to Portuguese intelligence reports, decided to leave for the Bahamas, having gone as far as giving a press conference to announce the move on July the 30th. At that point, Ribbentrop and Hitler got desperate, and they decided that the only option left was to outright abduct the couple. A well-known Portuguese banker, Dr. Ricardo de Espírito Santo e Silva, was urged by Ribbentrop to, quote, make the most earnest effort to prevent his departure tomorrow, being the 1st of August. Wallis was sent an anonymous gift of flowers with a greeting card that had an ominous warning. The Portuguese Prime Minister was pressured into keeping them on the Iberian Peninsula. One of their chauffeurs was bribed to refuse to go to the Bahamas, and the car that was meant to take the couple's luggage to the ship was sabotaged, making it an hour late to the port. To top it all off, the cherry on top, a bomb threat on the ship that was meant to take them to the Bahamas, the SS Excalibur, was also fabricated, leading to yet another delay while authorities searched the ship and cleared it. But despite all of these dramatics, Edward and Wallis safely left for the Bahamas on the evening of August 1st, 1940. That same day, Hitler ordered a full-scale attack on Britain. Edward didn't exactly leave without a goodbye present. Apparently, he had agreed on a code word with his friend, with his host, Dr. Ricardo, which, if used, would be seen by Edward as a signal to immediately return to Europe. 2 weeks later, on the 15th of August, while Edward was in Bermuda and Britain was fighting for its survival, Edward sent a coded telegram to Dr. Ricardo asking him to send a communication as soon as action was advisable. Now this, according to Traitor King author Andrew Loney, amounted to communication with a foreign agent during wartime, which meant that Edward could technically have been prosecuted under the Treachery Act of 1940. Except he wasn't. In fact, Edward was spared of practically any consequences with regards to any of his questionable actions preceding and during the war. But we'll leave that for a future installment in this series because that's a whole topic in and of itself. So, your homework is to answer the following question based on the information you gleaned from today's video in the comments. Edward and Harry, dukes of treachery or useful idiots? Or both?